Hey, how's it going? It is me, Todd, back with another video. So this one is all about basically like some research I've done on climate change and why I'm a bit doomer pilled, I guess, as to the future of humanity. I know that sounds very hyperbolic and might describe it as delusional or crazy. Um, but I don't know if that's entirely accurate. I've I've been following climate issues for a while, but over the last year, I've learned a lot more than I previously did. I think, generally speaking, most people think, well, the answer to climate change is to, uh, drive electric cars, use solar panels, and not use plastic bottles. You know, um, which are things that do help, but um, they don't help enough. The idea of a individual's carbon footprint is kind of it's I, I think it's been described as like 1 second of the basically it's not that much in the grand scheme of things. When you look at everything done by corporations, companies, and humanity as a whole. So um, now a lot of my doomer pill comes from a number of articles I've read, which I will link in the description, as well as a documentary from Michael Moore. Oh, he produced it, but it wasn't. There's another guy that did it. Um, that also kind of opened my eyes to the realities of like climate change isn't just, oh, the earth gets hotter and it's unfortunate and uncomfortable. It is the consequences of that heating that are actually what's doomer pilling me, because it's a lot more it's a lot worse than just that. So which leads me to think that the solution to this climate change isn't reusable water, bottles or electric cars. It's a complete change in all of human society in terms of consumption, in terms of how we operate within our cities, in terms of energy usage. It's so many things that would have to be changed, and very drastically and relatively quickly. And that's why I don't, it's hard to have hope in that situation, because if you follow American politics, at least, nothing happens quickly. And the fact that we're kind of starting to see some of the issues of climate change, such as the heating and such as the more extreme weather, it's like this is kind of just the beginning. But the farther along you go, the more you start to see of the conditions that are necessary for certain crops to be grown will worsen to the point where, oh well, suddenly we can't grow the food that we need, and this is stuff that's covered in the documentary. It's called the documentary is called Planet of the Humans. It's available for free on YouTube, which I'll also link that in the description. It's a fascinating documentary, and it is also terrifying because they show how the way that we live is how that's basically kind of leading us off a cliff. You see how fish populations have been in decline for the last 20 years. You see how various industries are kind of in decline in the food, like, at least, and how now so those are in decline. The population of humans going up. I mean, it's that's where you start to see this. If you have a scarcity of food and an increase in people, you will have a sudden decrease in people. I read an article. I want to say it was just today. Not an article. It was a book I was reading. It's called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things by Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore. This book goes over basically, how it's a more in-depth look as to how we got here. But they talk about a a similar situation that happened in the 1300s, in which the climate had been warmer, and then suddenly the world went into a light ice age, and this caused crop failures, and what followed was mass starvation. I think it was something like 20% of the population of Europe died, and that was just Europe. It's a really a much smaller scale, of course, and but when you look at the entire world, articles say that living on the equator, and well, it'll be impossible. I mean, you won't be able to walk outside your door without suffering from heat stroke. You'll be cooked from within. It's also in the article I'll link. I'm actually gonna screen share it right now. There we go. If it'll let me. There we go. So this is. I hope this is showing up. So this is an article called "The Uninhabitable Earth" by David Wallace Wells. The article came out, I want to say, a few years ago. It's not brand new. It's a pretty detailed article. All their claims are, as you can see, not fact checked, but they're cited just by hovering over them. But one of the important things to look at is, as I mentioned before, the consequences of this global heating. So one of the things that's happening is, obviously areas that were previously cold or frozen are warming. And one such thing is the permafrost. Now here we have it talks about here the permafrost in Norway. It flooded this doomsday vault, which is, kind of ironic in a way. We can't quite escape the doomsday that's coming, or it's symbolic of that, I guess. But it touches down here. In this permafrost in the Arctic, twice as much carbon that is wrecking the planet right now. Let me read this real quick. In other words, we have trapped in Arctic permafrost twice as much carbon as is currently wrecking the atmosphere of the planet. All of it scheduled to be released at a date that keeps getting moved up, partially in the form of gas that multiplies its warming power 86 times over. So basically, there's a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere right now, and that's what's trapping in the heat that comes in from the sun, and which is causing this global warming. And so that heat is then warming up the Arctic permafrost, which will eventually release more greenhouse gases, which will hold in more heat, and the cycle will continue as global temperatures continue to increase and perpetuate that same process. And this is kind of this is the part of climate change that I don't think really gets talked about enough of, is that it's not just that it's going to get hot and the beaches are going to be warmer and more uncomfortable. It's that, you see here, but let's go a little bit farther down. There's more. There's another important part towards the end, but before I get there, I want to briefly go through a few other things. Talks here about the we're kind of going through the sixth mass extinction in Earth history. This having to do with a lot of it has to do with not just global warming, but just how humans have kind of spread out over the last couple centuries, especially into the Americas. Let's see. Here this talks about a similar event that happened, looks like 252 million years ago. Similar situation, carbon warmed the planet by 5 degrees. It accelerated when the warming triggered the release of methane in the Arctic and ended 97% of all life on Earth. So that's kind of what we're heading towards, is that this heat will essentially do this. And then let's see, we are currently adding carbon to the atmosphere at a considerable rate considerably faster rate, by most estimates, at least 10 times faster than was added back then. And of course, that was a natural process before when the carbon is being released and, the warming happens. But let's see. There you go. This is another important point. At 7 degrees of warming, that would become impossible for large portions of the planet's equatorial band, and especially the tropics, where humidity adds to the problem. In the jungles of Costa Rica, for example, where humidity routinely tops 90%, simply moving around outside when it's over 105 degrees Fahrenheit would be lethal. And the effects would be fast. Within a few hours, the human body would be cooked to death from both inside and out. Let's see, at 11 or 12 degrees of warming, more than half of the world's population as distributed today would die of direct heat. So at the current moment, the world's population is over 7 billion. So should nothing change, and should the individuals who live at the equatorial band, we're talking billions of deaths, and then that's not even counting for let's say like in a perfect situation, people are able to get out of there ahead of time. You have at least billions of climate refugees. I mean, either way, it's a terrible crisis that's likely to be here sooner than I think most people think. Because at the moment, it doesn't look like there's any real, there's small efforts being made to slow down or change the way that certain companies and corporations do things, and as we as a society do things, but not to the degree that it's necessary to really roll back any of this stuff. And so at present, most regions reach wet. Oh, that's something else. So since 1980, the planet has experienced a 50-fold increase in the number of places experiencing dangerous or extreme heat. The 5 warmest summers in Europe since 1500 have all occurred since 2002. The IPCC warns simply being outdoors that time of year will be unhealthy for much of the globe. I want to jump down. Here's an interesting note too. By the end of the century, the World Bank has estimated the coolest months in tropical South America, Africa, and the Pacific are likely to be warmer than the warmest months at the end of the 20th century. Of course, it mentions air conditioning can help, but will ultimately only add to the carbon problem. This is the thing when you talk about having to change the way that we live, that's part of it. It is not remotely plausible to wholesale air condition all the hottest parts of the world, many of them also the poorest. Worth noting there for sure as well. Where in the so here you go. As soon as several decades from now, the Hajj will become physically impossible for the 2 million Muslims who make the pilgrimage each year. And this is another important part here too. In the sugarcane region of El Salvador, as much as 1/5 of the population has chronic kidney disease, including over a quarter of the men. The presumed result of dehydration from working the fields they were able to comfortably harvest as recently as 2 decades ago. So this is a trend that will continue to get worse in El Salvador, but also continue to grow farther away from the equator. Here we go. Just outside the type of sentence in the California desert in mid-June. Again, this is I think 2017 or 2018. It's 120 degrees outside, 121 degrees, and it's not a record high for this California desert. And so this is, I think, an important part, and that part of what kind of concerns me at least is, the conditions necessary for food production are declining, or they're changing rapidly for sure. In some ways, we'll be able to perhaps move production to places that previously weren't open to production. But either way, there's going to be a huge disruption in food production, and this will have an effect for sure. I mean, we see it even now. Today is October 4th, 2021, and we're almost 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're still seeing shortages and supply chain issues as a result from that. Now just imagine that, but even worse, just further intensified. Maybe it would look more like it did last year, back when you couldn't get toilet paper, and certain things that you never thought of that require certain materials from certain places won't be able to get them because stuff like this. So here you go. The basic rule for staple cereal crops grown at optimal temperatures is that for every degree of warming, yields decline by 10%. Some estimates run as high as 15 or 17%, which means that if the planet is 5 degrees warmer at the end of the century, we may have as many as 50% more people to feed and 50% less grain to give them. It takes 16 calories of grain to produce just a single calorie of hamburger meat. So that's an important part too, is like when you look at how everything's interconnected. So if wheat production is going down, you can't feed as many people, you can't feed as many livestock, which in turn won't feed as many people. I mean, this is, kind of alarming. The tropics are already too hot to efficiently grow grain, and those places where the grain is produced today are already at optimal growing temperature, which means even a small warming will push them down the slope of declining productivity. Yields in places like remote Canada and Russia are limited by the quality of soil there. That's another important point, is while places like Greenland, which are traditionally, pretty cold and icy, while they might be more, they might have a better temperature to grow crops, the soil itself might not be, good enough to grow those crops. Drought might be an even bigger issue than the heat. Some of the world's most arable land turning quickly to desert. Precipitation is notoriously hard to monitor, yet predictions for later this century are basically unanimous. Unprecedented droughts nearly everywhere food is today produced. By 2080, without dramatic reductions in emissions, Southern Europe will be in permanent extreme drought, much worse than the American Dust Bowl ever was. I want to say a month or two ago, I read about Sicily, which is an island to the south of it, to the south of the Italian peninsula, had a number of wildfires. This nice island in the middle of the Mediterranean on fire. Of course, I mean, if you follow the news at all, wildfires aren't rare or out of the ordinary. I mean, I feel like every year there's always a picture of some place where you see the picture of the city in the background, and where you see the picture of a city and then an orange background from the color of the flames. I remember we saw it in Australia in early 2020. I want to say, was it late last year or early this year, when we saw it with San Francisco as well. It's, things like this becoming more and more common. That's just part of the more extreme weather, which I'm going to get to next. Here's an important thing too, climate plagues. So there are now trapped in the Arctic ice diseases that have not circulated in the air for millions of years, in some cases since before humans were around to encounter them. In Alaska, already researchers have discovered remnants of the 1918 flu. They extracted it from the cadaver of a frozen woman, interestingly enough. So this is another important thing. If you know anything about, the early days of European colonization of the Americas, you probably have learned that many Native Americans or indigenous people died from the various diseases that we brought over with us. And something like 90% of the indigenous population, at the end of it all, was wiped out. It would not be crazy to suggest that a similar situation is possible here. And I read before, a little farther up, that 97% of all life on Earth had been wiped out back during the last time the carbon heated up the atmosphere like this. At 3%, I mean, that's where we get, a lot of little microorganisms like this. So it's possible, it's entirely possible that we could end up with a pandemic worse than what we're seeing now. Hopefully not. We can't really handle a light pandemic all that well. Light as in, we're, when I say light, I mean, we could fight the pandemic better. We could do a lot of things better, but we can't for a whole number of reasons, even though we're equipped to do it. And with a far deadlier disease or virus, I don't I don't think the end. I don't think it would go well. And then here's another important point: unbreathable air. This is kind of even if this is probably even if we manage to survive all of this, let's say like we live in this dystopian world. It's it is what was that cyberpunk world, with Harrison Ford, Blade Runner, that kind of world. We get through all this stuff, even though corporations are still doing everything, and we as a society aren't really doing enough. We still have unbreathable air. So, what does this mean exactly? Well, the concentration of carbon, I want to say it's carbon in the air, is increasing. It's not just pure oxygen that we breathe; it's a whole collection of chemicals. So, let's see. At that compared to the air that we breathe now, human cognitive. Oh yeah, so here's another important thing. Okay, so our lungs need oxygen, but that is only a fraction of what we breathe. The fraction of carbon dioxide is growing. It just crossed 400 parts per million, and high-end estimates extrapolating from current trends suggest it will hit 1,000 parts per million by 2100. At that concentration, compared to the air we breathe now, human cognitive ability declines by 21%, likely because the brain is not getting enough oxygen. Although that is kind of a guess on my part. Let's see. Small increases in pollution capable of shortening lifespan by 10 years. And a lot of little things like this all added together, which don't paint a very good picture. We get some more forest fires, more droughts. Here's an important part. The Amazon, which provides 20% of our oxygen, parts of it are on fire. Other parts of it are being cut down by the government there. The Amazon isn't an important part of filtering out the carbon, and yeah, yikes. And of course, here's another important thing: is with resource shortages and the scarcity of, especially natural resources. When you look at if you look at in Southwest America right now, we have a bit of a water shortage. What happens when that happens on a more global scale? What if you're a nation that doesn't have water resources at your disposal? You still need that water. If you can't, this is where the idea of water wars comes into play. Which I remember my science teacher back in middle school talking about this like 15 years ago. I don't know if I fully understood what she meant by it back then, but I sure do now. Here we go. What accounts for relationship between climate? Some of it comes down to agriculture and economics. A lot has to do with forced migration. Already record high with 65 million people displaced. We're wondering right now. Individual irritability, heat increases, municipal crime rates, swearing on social media. A bunch of not good stuff. So every degree Celsius of warming costs on average 1.2% of the GDP. This is the sterling work in the field. The median projection is for a 20% loss in per capita earning globally by the end of the century, resulting from changes in agriculture, crime, storms, energy, mortality, and labor. Tracing the shape of the probability curve is even scarier. There is a 12% chance that climate change will reduce global output by more than 50% by 2100, they say, and a 51% chance that it lowers per capita GDP by 20%, or by more than, unless emissions decline. By comparison, the Great Recession lowered global GDP by about 6% in a one-time shock. So, they estimate a 1 in 8 chance of an ongoing and irreversible effect by the end of the century that is 8 times worse. Yeah, it's not good. Here's another important point this is what I'm actually going to touch on in the next article I've got. The sea will become a killer. We'll see a 4 feet sea rise level, and possibly 10 by the end of the century. A third of the world's major cities are on the coast. Not to mention power plants, et cetera, et cetera. Even those above 10 feet will flood much more easily. So even if you have certain barriers, still could, get storm surge, etc. At least 600 million people live within 10 meters of sea level today. I do as well. I currently live in St. Petersburg, Florida. Uh, so odds are in 100 years or 80 years, St. Pete's going to have some difficulties uh, trying to hold back the ocean, which, you can do to an extent, but you still, you look at New Orleans, it's, they had the levees during Hurricane Katrina, which recently held with, I think it was Hurricane Ida. I don't remember for sure. But, you're always kind of left, waiting and seeing if you're going to make it or if this is the one that floods your town, and it's hard for it's hard for a town to come back after something like that, or for a city to come back. Um, at present, more than a third of the world's carbon is sucked up by the oceans, which is good because otherwise we'd have a lot more warming. But the result is what is called ocean acidification, which on its own may add half a degree to warming this century. You've probably heard of coral bleaching, which is the death of the coral reefs. And reefs support as much as a quarter of all marine life and supply food for 500 million people. So that goes back to declining, sea life. And enjoy your seafood while you can, because if you're still around in 80 years, or probably less, it may start to get more expensive. Ocean acidification will fry fish populations directly, too. Though scientists aren't yet sure how to predict the effects on stuff we haul out of the ocean to eat. They do know that in acid waters, oysters and mussels will struggle to grow their shells, and that when the pH of human blood drops as much as the ocean's pH has over the last generation, it induces seizures, comas, and sudden death. And that's not all that ocean acidification can do. Carbon absorption can initiate a feedback loop in which under oxygenated waters breed different kinds of microbes that turn the water more anoxic. First in the deep ocean, dead zones, and then gradually up towards the surface. There, the small fish die out, unable to breathe, which means oxygen-eating bacteria thrive, and the feedback loop doubles back. And here's a kind of a scary one here, because this big yikes. Hydrogen sulfide is bubbling out of the sea along a 1,000-mile stretch of land known as the Skeleton Coast. Hydrogen sulfide is so toxic that evolution has trained us to recognize the tiniest, safest traces of it, which is why our noses are so exquisitely skilled at registering flatulence. Hydrogen sulfide is also the thing that finally did us in. That time, 97% of all life on Earth died, as I mentioned earlier on in the article. Once all the feedback loops had been triggered and the circulating jet streams of a warmed ocean grounded to a halt, its planet's preferred gas for a natural holocaust. So, yeah, doomer. I'm very doomer pilled off of reading this article, which mentions a lot of things I have already previously read, but kind of connects them together in a terrifying way. The Great Filter. As good a title as I've ever read for something like this. So, I guess, quick story. What is a Great Filter? There's a theory that in order for any civilization to make contact with an alien species, they have to essentially pass through a Great Filter, which is basically a do or die moment for that civilization. And should that species pass through the Great Filter, then they go on to theoretically explore the universe and so forth. And if they don't, they essentially die off, or they they get the clock wound way back. Which, if we're lucky, that might be what happens. But it took millions of years for the previous warming trend to go back to normal, and humans have only been around for hundreds of thousands of years. So, humans and their similar related species. So, yeah, the strongest hurricanes will come more often, and we'll have to invent new categories with which to describe them. Tornadoes will grow longer and wider. and strike more frequently, hail rocks will quadruple in size. Humans used to watch the weather to prophesize the future. Going forward, we will see its wrath, the vengeance of the past. In its wrath, the vengeance of the past. More than half of the carbon humanity has exhaled into the atmosphere in its entire history has been emitted in just the past 3 decades. Since the end of World War II, the figure is 85%, which means that in the length of a single generation, global warming has brought us to the brink of planetary catastrophe. And that the story of the industrial world's kamikaze mission is also the story of a single lifetime. So that's, here's one tiny bit of hope, I guess. Carbon capture, untested technology to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which Wally Brecker estimates will cost at least $7 trillion, and various forms of geoengineering, the catch-all name for a variety of moonshot technologies, far-fetched enough that many climate scientists prefer to regard them as dreams or nightmares from science fiction. Or the aerosol approach, dispersing so much sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere that when it converts to sulfuric acid, it will cloud a fifth of the horizon and reflect back 2% of the sun's rays, buying the planet at least a little wiggle room heat-wise. Of course, it would make our sunsets very red, would bleach the sky, and would make more acid rain. But you have to look at the magnitude of the problem. You got to watch that you don't say the giant problem shouldn't be solved because its solution causes some smaller problems. Which, I think this is a good conversation starting point of what kind of solutions should we start looking at. If the problem is so large, the solutions ought to be large as well. And I don't know of any that are realistically being even talked about in at least American politics. I know there's talk of a Green New Deal, which is quite unlikely to actually pass, at least anytime soon. Maybe once the consequences of climate change are more present and prevalent in everyone's day-to-day life. I think that's what it's going to take, probably. But even then, people are stubborn. A lot of people, at least in America, are skeptical of government as a solution to a problem. But I guess we'll have to see the future. Anton, carbon tax, a lot of carbon taxes. In a universe that is many billions of years old, the star system separated as much by time and space, civilizations might emerge and develop and burn themselves up simply too fast to ever find one another. That goes back to the Great Filter. Peter Ward, a charismatic paleontologist, among those responsible for discovering that the planet's mass extinctions were caused by greenhouse gas, calls this the Great Filter. Civilizations rise, but there's an environmental filter that causes them to die off again and disappear fairly quickly. The mass extinction we are now living through has only just begun. So much more dying is coming. And that's, I think that's something that needs to be talked about a lot more as well. It's the quote unquote elephant in the room. We cannot have such a large population increased while the resources necessary to feed and, sustain that population is not necessarily there. At least, I'm sure we'll be able to develop new technologies that will help, but I don't know if, when we've got 15 billion people here, I just don't see it, especially when most of what is done always comes from a profit motive as opposed to, humanitarian motivation. So the scientists know that to even meet the Paris goals by 2050, carbon emissions from energy and industry, which are still rising, will have to fall by half each decade. Emissions from land use, deforestation, cow farts, etc., will have to zero out, and we will need to have invented technologies to extract annually twice as much carbon from the atmosphere as the entire planet's plants now do. Somehow scientists have an enormous confidence in the ingenuity of humans, confidence perhaps bolstered by their appreciation for climate change, which is, after all, a human invention too. They point to the Apollo project, which the hole in the ozone we patched in the 1980s, the passing of the fear of mutually assured destruction, Now we've found our way to engineer out of doomsday, and surely we will find a way to engineer out of this. The planet is not used to being baroque like this, and climate systems designed to give feedback over centuries or millennia prevent us, even those who may be watching closely, from fully imagining the damage done already to the planet. But when we do truly see the world we've made, they say, we will also find a way to make it livable. For them, the alternative is simply unimaginable, which is not unsurprising. So that is the article that, I mean, I was kind of already in a doomer mode by the time I got to this article, but I guess you could say this one sealed the deal. I don't know the year of this. It's not that old. Let me just see if I can get a date. I'm using my MacBook right now as opposed to my regular computer because it crapped out on me, and not really used to this. So let's see, uninhabitable Earth, 2017. That's what I thought. Depicts a worst case scenario of what might happen in the near future due to global warming. If your anxiety about global warming is dominated by fears of sea level rise, you're barely scratching the surface of what terrors are possible. And I think that is the probably most important part you could read going into it, is that it's quite bad. So the second article ties directly into the ocean acidification. This right here, the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, it basically shows the movement of we've got warm water going up into like in this part area, warm water going up into northern Europe, and then cold water being filtered or whatever, moved back down to the south. It's basically it's a whole line of water movement that circulates cold and warm water. You have part of the Gulf Stream here, which is what keeps Europe temperate. And basically, this is slowing down this whole process, the movement of the water. It's also, I want to say, I'll read it in here somewhere, but it's something to do with it moves salt from the northern parts down south, and it's a really big process. I mean, the planet really is almost a living organism, the way that it functions. Anyway, so this article came out shortly after Texas had that whole bomb cyclone. Where most of it froze, their power grid failed, people were burning fences in their yard to stay warm. It was crazy, to say the least. But this is one of the one of those consequences of the climate change, is that, the weather patterns that, okay, so I'll just read it. The article can explain it a lot better than I can. Okay, so this week, North America experienced the results of a bomb cyclone, a phenomenon that happens when Arctic air spills out of the Arctic and drools down over North America. Normally, that air is kept bottled up in the Arctic by a rigid, fast-moving river of air that circles the North Pole called the jet stream. So, if you're watching how the Arctic freezing weather is escaping. The upper atmosphere jet stream, that circular river of air that rotates around the northern polar region, is more like a perpetual front created by the difference in temperature between the frozen North Polar region and the warmer regions a few hundred miles to the south. The front of the jet stream thus acts like a wall around a fortress that keeps all Arctic cold air stable and holds it over the North Polar region. Just like the intensity of a thunderstorm front is determined by the difference in temperature between the warmer air in front of it and the cold air behind it, the strength of the jet stream is the result of how cold the Arctic is versus how warm the rest of the northern hemisphere is. Global warming, however, has sped up the warming of the Arctic region between 2 and 6 times faster than the rest of the northern hemisphere. Polar ice has radically melted in the last 4 decades, replacing white sunlight, heat reflecting with open blue black water, which absorbs heat. So basically, the ice is not reflecting the heat back into the back outside the atmosphere. It is being retained in the ocean water. This reduced the difference in temperature between the polar regions and the rest of the northern hemisphere so much that the jet stream itself has weakened. As the atmospheric jet stream weakens, it can't continue to block freezing polar air from exclusively over the Arctic. That jet stream river air thus begins to loop and drool down over North America. So basically, the stream is not strong enough to contain the Arctic air, and it spills out just as it did over Texas. It begins in the freezing Arctic air behind it spills over us. The result is a current weather situation. Well, what was then the current weather situation across the United States? If I remember correctly, it appeared like it looked worse in Texas, but at the time, I want to say that all but 3 American states were covered in snow. It was like Florida, Hawaii, and some other state, probably, I don't know, Alabama or something. So it's getting insanely cold here in North America right now because the Arctic has warmed up so much. If this pattern continues to grow in frequency and severity, it will even further disrupt food production in North America. So there you go, back to a decrease in food production. If it gets sufficiently severe, we could see major food shortages. And yeah, so this is, a lot of people, a lot of critics of climate change will say, how the hell is the planet warming if Texas is covered in ice? And from an outside perspective, if you don't know the climate science, it's a reasonable question. Like when you hear global warming, you don't think of ice or more ice in places where traditionally there isn't ice. But what's important to look at is the consequences and effects of that climate change. Why is there ice here when there normally isn't here? Well, it's because the Arctic is heating up, and the Arctic is unable to. With the Arctic heating up, the Arctic jet stream that maintains that cool air is weakening, and that's where it comes from. And here we go with the Great Conveyor Belt is breaking down and wreaking havoc. This is let's see, the global warming is messing with the temperature differentials in the extreme north to disrupt the atmospheric jet stream. But there's a similar crisis happening with ocean temperature differentials. These maintain an ocean flow of warm water from around the southern tip of Africa up to the east coast of South and North America and across the Atlantic, where they release heat acquired in the South Pacific and the equatorial region into an area between Iceland and northern Spain. Scientists call this the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, but it's popularly known as the Gulf Stream. It is also called the Great Conveyor Belt, as it conveys heat from southern climes to the east coast of North America and Western Europe. The heat released by the ocean currently then blows over Europe, guaranteeing their ability to feed themselves. So think about that. So let's say this Gulf Stream stops, as all right, it's right here. If the oceanic Gulf Stream were to weaken or fail, Europe would be plunged into a winter that might not go away, or it won't go away until the Gulf Stream is able to come back. The Gulf Stream has failed over the course of Earth's history, and the results are quite cold, but it can't come back. But it's important to note that it won't come back in our lifetimes. Europe would be plunged into a winter that might not go away. This, in fact, is believed to be one of the primary mechanisms behind the last ice age. It was the plot device for the disaster movie The Day After Tomorrow, and has had European scientists increasingly worried for the last few decades. Burning of fossil fuels is a culprit. Naturally, nothing new there. This severe winter weather is a warning. If we don't get our carbon emissions under control and quickly, severe weather disruptions that are initially inconvenient will become civilization threatening and eventually could bring down the human species overall. The crisis is now. So, that's that seems to be where we are at as a species, I guess, as humans, because this is obviously, if you have the money, you can just fly to the space station, I guess. But if you plan on staying on the planet, this is something that will probably affect the rest of your life, or at least later in life, if not now. For example, when you think of retirement hotspots right now, if you're, let's say you're 60, 70, you want to, leave home or leave wherever you're living at and retire in a paradise, right? You might want to come to Florida. Well, that probably won't be a top option, 60 years from now. I mean, just during, I want to say Hurricane Dorian, fairly recent, one of the hurricanes in the last few years, basically flooded Miami and, brought in tons of sand onto their streets. It was quite a mess. But, when you look at the intensification of those hurricanes and uh, the higher volume of hurricanes over time, I mean, you know, it's not going to be pretty. We've in Florida, we've been extremely lucky this year. We haven't really had any major hurricanes. Of course, I mean, knock on wood, we still have the rest of October, but you know, oh, who knows when the next big one's going to be, basically. And it's not just Florida, but I mean, you've got hurricanes flooding the New York City subway stations. You've got, I mean, there's it's affecting us in so many ways. I don't know if people always connect that to the consequences of climate change and action. I think we will start to see it, especially in the next several decades, as crop shortages begin and as certain items begin to grow in price. I've read before that the necessary conditions for growing coffee are getting worse and worse, or the conditions or the locations available with the necessary conditions to grow coffee are getting worse. So, if you think coffee is expensive now, wait 30, 40 years, and this is all very, like, from my opinion, it seems quite likely to happen. If what it takes to, well, here's one statistic. I think they went over this in the movie Planet of the Humans, the one I mentioned before, that all of the environmental protections and decisions that had been made leading up to the COVID pandemic paled in comparison to the actual shutdowns, or to the effects of the shutdowns. For example, during the while we were locked down in America, and I know other countries were locked down a lot longer, emissions went down, and the carbon footprint, actually drastically, well, not drastically, but it went down quite a bit. Not for long, but it was quite a substantial dip, more so than throughout the last 20 years of Al Gore's movies and solar panels. So it shows that that was a drastic change in lifestyle for everyone involved. Not many people were big fans of it, but it was a major change in the way that we live, and it seems like that's what it's going to take in order for this crisis to be not necessarily averted, but perhaps not allowed to worsen. We're already, there are certain things that are already in motion that we can't stop anymore. That we're still going to have severe weather in the future. We're still going to have flooding and wildfires. That's not going to end tomorrow if we all suddenly stop using electricity or stop eating beef. But we can still, we can still make it so that the worst thing that happens is a wildfire or a horrible hurricane, as opposed to a die off of billions of people. So yeah, that's what's got me on my doomer arc, I guess. I'll link those two articles in the description, and I will also link the Michael Moore documentary, Planet of the Humans. That was the movie that probably really doomer pilled me, because it just really shows that the changes necessary are probably outside of what people are willing to do. Yeah. So thanks for watching. Don't give up, and I will see you next time, hopefully.